You're not officer material, son. I've been doing this for 15 years, and I know what I'm looking at. You'd be lucky to make corporal." The words landed in the middle of a government-issue waiting room that smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and old coffee. A room where 3 other teenagers sat on plastic chairs with their enlistment paperwork folded in their laps. They heard every word. They looked at the floor. Staff Sergeant Dale Pruitt said it the way a man says something he has said 100 times before, not with cruelty exactly, but with the flat, certain authority of someone who had never once been wrong about a thing like this. He leaned back in his swivel chair, arms crossed, and studied the young man across the desk the way a man studies a car he has no intention of buying. The young man did not flinch. He sat with his hands resting on his thighs, his back straight, his eyes level. He was 17 years old, the son of a postal worker and a school teacher, and he had walked 3 miles that morning to reach this recruiting station in East Columbus, Ohio, because he did not own a bus pass and had not wanted to ask his mother for one. What Pruitt did not know, what he could not have imagined sitting in that chair with his coffee going cold beside him, was who he had just dismissed. He had no idea what this boy was carrying inside him, what he had already built in silence, what he would go on to become. And when the truth came out, it did not merely embarrass Dale Pruitt. It outlasted him. It outlasted the recruiting station itself. But before we get there, let me take you back to the beginning. Let me show you who Marcus DeWitt really was long before the world was asked to decide. Now, here's what most people didn't know about Marcus DeWitt. He had been reading military history since he was 9 years old. Not the kind of reading a child does to impress a teacher, the deep, solitary kind, conducted by lamplight in a narrow bedroom on the 2nd floor of a house on Maplewood Avenue, where the radiator knocked every 20 minutes and the smell of his mother's cooking climbed the stairs and settled around him like a second blanket. He read about Frederick Douglass and the 54th Massachusetts. He read about the Buffalo Soldiers, about Benjamin O. Davis Sr., about the men who had carried dignity into systems designed to deny it. He did not read these books as history. He read them as instruction. His grandfather, Raymond DeWitt, had served in Korea. Raymond was not a man who spoke often, but when he did, the words had weight. He had told Marcus once, sitting on the back porch of that same house on Maplewood Avenue, shelling butter beans into a metal bowl, that the most dangerous thing a young black man could do was let someone else write his ceiling. "They'll always try to put a lid on you," Raymond said, not looking up from the bowl. "Don't argue with the lid. Just build until you outgrow it." Marcus had been 11. He had not fully understood, but he had not forgotten. He carried that instruction the way you carry something you don't yet know how to use, carefully and close to the body. By the time Marcus was 14, he had read every military biography the Columbus Metropolitan Library branch on Livingston Avenue owned. He had begun keeping a composition notebook, not a diary, but something more deliberate, a running analysis of battlefield decisions, of logistical failures, of the moments when leadership had bent history. His mother, Evelyn DeWitt, a 5th-grade teacher who had spent 20 years watching children be underestimated, saw what her son was doing and said nothing to diminish it. She simply kept the library card current and made sure the lamp in his room had a working bulb. At school, Marcus was not the loudest. His teachers knew him as steady, thorough, the kind of student who turned in work that was better than the assignment required and never made a production of it. His ROTC instructor at Columbus East High School, a retired master sergeant named Gerald Okafor, had told Evelyn at a parent-teacher conference that her son had a quality he rarely saw: the ability to think 3 moves ahead without telegraphing it. Okafor had said it quietly, the way you say something you want to be remembered. Evelyn had written it down when she got home. Marcus had moved in silence. He had built in silence, and on a Tuesday morning in November of 1987, he walked 3 miles to a recruiting station to ask about the path to a commission, because he had read enough to know that a commission was where decisions were made. He was not there to enlist as a private. He was there to ask about ROTC scholarships, about officer candidate school, about the specific educational requirements for a commission in the United States Army. He never got to ask the question. Now, here's what you need to understand about Staff Sergeant Dale Pruitt. Pruitt had worked the Columbus East Recruiting Station for 11 years. He was 41 years old, a compact, ruddy-faced man with a careful mustache and a pressed uniform he wore like a credential. He had made his career on numbers: enlistment quotas, processing efficiency, the clean arithmetic of young men and women steered into slots. He had a plaque on the wall behind his desk, awarded for exceeding quarterly targets 3 years running. He looked at it sometimes when a conversation was going the way he expected. Pruitt had a theory about potential. He had developed it over 11 years and held it with the confidence of a man who had never had to defend it to anyone who mattered. He believed he could tell, within the first 2 minutes of a conversation, what a recruit was made of, by posture, by vocabulary, by the way they held eye contact or didn't. He had never written this theory down. It lived in him the way a bias lives in a man who has mistaken familiarity for expertise. When Marcus DeWitt walked through the door that Tuesday morning, Pruitt made his assessment in approximately 30 seconds. He saw a black teenager from the east side, slightly worn sneakers, no car in the lot. He saw the composition notebook tucked under the boy's arm and registered it as an affectation. He did not ask what was in it. He asked Marcus's age, his GPA, and whether he had ever been in trouble with the law. Then he told him what slot he thought the boy would fit. He did not ask what Marcus wanted. That was the error. Not the cruelty of the words, though the words were cruel enough. The error was the certainty. The absolute, unexamined certainty that he already knew everything worth knowing about the young man sitting across from him. What Pruitt could not see was that Marcus DeWitt had already done more rigorous study of military leadership than most second lieutenants in the United States Army. He could not see the composition notebook's 200 pages of strategic analysis. He could not see Gerald Okafor's assessment, or Raymond DeWitt's instruction, or Evelyn DeWitt's 20 years of refusing to let the world write her son's ceiling. He could not see any of it, because he had not looked. He had not looked. Marcus sat in that plastic chair and received Dale Pruitt's verdict with his hands flat on his thighs and his back straight and his expression unchanged. He said 6 words total. "Thank you for your time." Then he stood, picked up the composition notebook, and walked out into the November cold. He did not slam the door. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue with the lid. He walked 3 miles home and told his grandfather what had happened. Raymond DeWitt listened without interrupting. When Marcus finished, the old man was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good. Now you know what you're working against. Build anyway." Marcus opened the composition notebook that evening and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. Beneath it, he wrote 1 sentence. He said, "I wasn't officer material." He underlined it twice. Then he turned the page and kept going. It was about to get worse before it got better. but it was going to get better. The following spring, Marcus applied for an Army ROTC scholarship through Ohio State University. He wrote directly to the program, submitted his transcripts, his ROTC record from Columbus East, and a personal statement that Gerald Okafor helped him refine over 4 drafts. The scholarship committee reviewed his application along with 340 others. They awarded him a 4-year scholarship, full tuition, full fees. He was one of 11 recipients that year from the state of Ohio. He did not call Dale Pruitt to tell him. Now, here's what the world would come to understand about Marcus DeWitt over the next 3 decades. He graduated from Ohio State in 1992 with a degree in political science and a commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. He reported to his first duty station at Fort Benning, Georgia, with the same composition notebook, a different one now, the 7th in a series, and the same quality Gerald Okafor had described years before: the ability to think 3 moves ahead without telegraphing it. His early years in the Army were marked by the same invisible industry that had defined his childhood. He was not the officer who sought attention. He was the officer whose units performed. His soldiers trusted him because he learned their names, their families, their particular strengths within the first week of every assignment. His superiors noticed, quietly and then less quietly. By 1999, he was a major. By 2004, a lieutenant colonel commanding a battalion in Iraq, where his unit's record for minimizing civilian casualties while maintaining operational effectiveness became a case study used at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. He never raised his voice in a command briefing. He never dressed down a subordinate in front of others. He had learned from Raymond DeWitt and Gerald Okafor, and 20 years of studying the men who had led well and the men who had led badly, that the loudest person in the room was rarely the most powerful one. By 2015, Brigadier General Marcus DeWitt had a record spanning 3 combat deployments, 2 Pentagon assignments, and a master's degree in strategic intelligence from the National Defense University. He had been decorated 4 times. His name appeared in the professional literature of military leadership, not as a curiosity but as a reference point. In the spring of 2019, the President of the United States nominated Marcus DeWitt for a 4th star. The confirmation hearing before the Senate Armed Services Committee lasted 2 days. Senators from both parties asked him about strategy, about ethics, about the future of the Army's officer corps. He answered each question with precision, steadiness, and the kind of moral clarity that is not performed but simply present. He was confirmed unanimously, 32 years after a staff sergeant in East Columbus had told him he would be lucky to make corporal. The Army's Public Affairs Office issued a press release. It ran in the Columbus Dispatch on a Thursday morning. Evelyn DeWitt, retired and living in the same house on Maplewood Avenue, read it at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee. She did not call anyone. She sat with it for a while the way you sit with something that has been a long time coming. Raymond DeWitt had died in 2003. He had not lived to see the 4th star, but he had lived to see the commission, the major's oak leaves, the battalion command. At Marcus's promotion to lieutenant colonel, Raymond had sat in the front row at Fort Benning in a dark suit, and when the insignia was pinned, the old man nodded once, slowly, the way a man nods when a long calculation has finally come out right. Now, here's what happened to Dale Pruitt. In the weeks after Marcus DeWitt's confirmation made the papers, a journalist named Carla Simmons at the Columbus Dispatch began work in a follow-up piece on the general's origins in the city. She interviewed Evelyn DeWitt, Gerald Okafor, and several of Marcus's classmates from Columbus East. In the course of her reporting, she found 3 people who had been in the waiting room of the recruiting station on that Tuesday morning in November of 1987. All 3 of them remembered the same thing. All 3 of them remembered Dale Pruitt's words. Simmons reached out to Pruitt, who had retired from the Army in 1999 and was living in a suburb of Columbus. He declined to comment on the record. He declined twice. The piece ran on a Sunday. It was picked up by the Associated Press and ran in 47 newspapers and on the websites of 6 television networks. The headline was not kind, though it was accurate. The recruiting district issued a statement acknowledging the incident and affirming the Army's commitment to equitable assessment of all applicants. The statement did not mention Pruitt by name. It did not need to. His name was already in the 47 newspapers. Marcus DeWitt, when asked by Simmons for a comment about Pruitt specifically, said 7 words. He gave me something to build toward. He did not elaborate, not with anger, not with revenge, simply with the weight of what he had built, laid quietly on the record for anyone who cared to read it. Carla Simmons had grown up on the east side of Columbus herself. She had gone to Columbus East High School, 2 years behind Marcus. She had known of him, the quiet one with the notebook, the one Gerald Okafor talked about. When she sat down to write the piece, she wrote it the way you write something that has been waiting 30 years to be written. She wrote it carefully and true, and she did not soften a single word of what Dale Pruitt had said in that waiting room. She had risked her editor's patience and 2 weeks of her own time to track down those 3 witnesses. It was the most important piece she had written in 20 years. She knew it when she filed it. Her editor knew it when he read it. It won a regional press award the following spring. And somewhere in a suburb of Columbus, Dale Pruitt read his name in 47 newspapers and understood, for the first time in his life, what it felt like to have someone else write your ceiling. The composition notebooks, all 23 of them, spanning 1984 to 2019, were donated by Marcus DeWitt to the Columbus Metropolitan Library in 2021. They are housed in the library's Ohio room, in a climate-controlled case, available to any researcher who asks. The branch on Livingston Avenue, where a 14-year-old boy had read every military biography on the shelf, displays a photograph of General DeWitt in its community gallery. He is not in uniform in the photograph. He is sitting on the back porch of the house on Maplewood Avenue, in the same chair where Raymond DeWitt once shelled butter beans into a metal bowl. He is looking at something outside the frame. He looks like a man who has been thinking for a very long time and has finally arrived at the answer. There is a composition notebook open in his lap. Now, there is a story that runs parallel to Marcus DeWitt's, one that the Columbus Dispatch piece did not have room to tell in full. It belongs to a woman named Denise Okafor, the daughter of Gerald Okafor. She had watched her father prepare that personal statement through 4 drafts. She had sat at the kitchen table on those evenings, doing her own homework, listening to the low, careful conversation between her father and the quiet boy with the notebook. Her father had told her once, when she was 12 and had come home furious after a teacher dismissed her answer in front of the class, that the people who needed to be the loudest in the room were always the ones with the least to say. "Do the work," he said, stirring his coffee. "Let the work be the noise." Denise had taken that instruction and carried it close to the body, without display. She had grown up 3 streets over from Marcus, in a house that smelled of library paste and the particular warmth of a home where books were furniture rather than decoration. Gerald Okafor had raised her to understand that credentials were not the same thing as knowledge, that a title on a door was not the same thing as authority, and that the most dangerous assumption a person could make was that the room already knew what it was looking at. Denise went to Ohio State 2 years after Marcus, on an academic scholarship she earned by writing a paper on logistics theory that her economics professor submitted without telling her, to a regional undergraduate competition. It placed second. She found out when the award letter arrived at her parents' house. She read it, standing in the kitchen, still in her coat, then sat down and wrote her father a letter thanking him for the noise. She spent the next 15 years building something that no one in the rooms she moved through expected her to be building. Now, here's what most people did not know about Denise Okafor in the spring of 2007. She was 33 years old, and she was the founder and sole owner of a supply chain consulting firm called Meridian Logistics Group, incorporated in the state of Ohio, with contracts in 4 states and a client list that included 2 regional hospital networks and a mid-sized defense subcontractor outside Dayton. She had built it from a spare bedroom in a rented Columbus apartment, working nights and weekends while holding a day job as a logistics analyst in Grove City. She had not borrowed money from family. She had not taken on a partner. She had written every proposal herself, won every contract herself, and delivered results her clients renewed without negotiation because the numbers did not require explanation. She had not advertised. She had not sought press. She had done the work, and the work had been the noise. Her firm's annual revenue in 2007 was just under $4 million. She employed 11 people, 8 of them women, 4 of them from the east side of Columbus. She had not announced any of this. It was simply true, the way a building is true. It stands whether or not you're looking at it. The morning everything changed smelled of hotel coffee and a conference room sealed too long, the particular staleness of a space where important people gathered to make decisions about other people's futures. It was the 3rd week of March, and Denise Okafor had driven to Cincinnati to attend a procurement conference hosted by a consortium of regional manufacturing firms. She had been invited by one of her existing clients, a procurement director named Vivian Torres, who had told her that 3 consortium member companies were actively looking for supply chain partners and that Denise's work spoke for itself. She arrived in a charcoal blazer and dark slacks, carrying a leather portfolio containing her firm's performance data, 3 client reference letters, and a 1-page capability summary. She did not carry business cards designed to impress. She carried evidence. What she did not know, walking into that conference room, was that the morning was about to require everything her father had ever taught her about staying still when the room wanted her to move. Now, here's what you need to understand about Richard Calhoun. He was the managing director of Calhoun Industrial Partners, a Cincinnati-based procurement consultancy that had been in his family for 2 generations. He was 54 years old, broad-shouldered, with the easy confidence of a man who had inherited a room and never had to earn it. He sat at the head of every table he entered as a matter of habit rather than invitation. He wore his certainty the way he wore his watch, visibly, and as a statement of position. Calhoun had been the informal chair of the consortium's vendor selection process for 3 years. He did not hold the title officially, but he held the influence, and in rooms like this one, influence and title were often the same thing. The other consortium members deferred to his read on vendors because deferring to him was easier than forming an independent opinion. He had a theory about vendor quality. not dissimilar in structure to the theory Dale Pruitt had held about officer potential, built from pattern recognition and familiarity, with the texture of expertise but not the substance. He had passed over good work before on the basis of this theory. He would not have described it as bias. He would have described it as experience. When Denise Okafor introduced herself during the morning networking session, Calhoun looked at her the way Pruitt had looked at Marcus DeWitt, a rapid, conclusive assessment that registered the surface and stopped there. He saw a woman he did not recognize from a firm he had not heard of, without the institutional affiliations he used as shorthand for credibility. He smiled the smile of a man who has already decided and is being polite about it. "Meridian Logistics," he said, reading her portfolio cover. "How long have you been operating?" 7 years, Denise said. He nodded in the way that means the opposite of acknowledgement. He turned to the man beside him and resumed a conversation that had not, in any meaningful sense, been interrupted. Denise noted it. She did not react to it. She moved to the next conversation. It was about to get considerably worse. The afternoon session was a structured vendor presentation format. 15 minutes per firm, a panel of 5 consortium representatives, Calhoun at the center. Denise had prepared for 15 minutes. She had her data, her references, the kind of preparation that looks effortless because it is thorough. She was the 4th presenter. She set her portfolio on the table, introduced herself and Meridian, and had spoken for approximately 4 minutes when Calhoun interrupted. "I'm going to stop you there," he said, in the tone of a man performing patience. "We typically work with firms that have a national footprint. You're regional, correct?" "We operate in 4 states," Denise said. "Our contract with Midwest Regional Health covers facilities in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky." "Right," Calhoun said. "Regional." He wrote something on the pad in front of him. The other 4 panel members watched him write it. None of them spoke. There were 11 other people in the room. Vendors who had already presented, consortium staff, Vivian Torres near the back wall. Vivian's jaw had tightened. She had seen this before, and she recognized what she was watching, and she was calculating what she could do about it without losing her standing in the consortium. Calhoun set down his pen. "What's your bonding capacity?" Denise gave the figure. It was legitimate, appropriate to the contract she held. Calhoun made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "That's going to be a limiting factor for us." He glanced at the man to his left, who obliged with a small nod. "I think what we're looking for is a partner with more institutional depth. No offense intended. No offense intended." The phrase that means offense was very much intended, and everyone in the room understood it, and no one said so. Denise Okafor sat with her hands resting on the portfolio, and her back straight and her expression unchanged. She had been here before, in smaller rooms and larger ones. She knew that the moment a person like Calhoun expected her to become was the moment she had the most to gain by remaining exactly who she was. She said, "I have 3 more minutes on my time. May I continue?" Calhoun leaned back. "Go ahead." She continued. She finished on time, to the second. She thanked the panel, gathered her portfolio, and returned to her seat. She did not look at Calhoun. She did not need to. What she did not know yet was that Vivian Torres, in the back of that room, had already decided to do something that would cost her a week of careful political maneuvering and the goodwill of at least one consortium board member. She had watched Richard Calhoun do this twice before, to 2 other vendors, and had said nothing both times, and the weight of that silence had been accumulating in her for 3 years. After the session broke, Vivian found Denise in the hallway and said quietly, "I need to show you something. Tonight, if you can stay." Denise looked at her. "I can stay." What Vivian Torres had was not a weapon. It was a record. She had been on the consortium's vendor selection committee for 4 years, and she had kept, in a personal file on her laptop, a running documentation of every vendor Calhoun had dismissed without a full review. The firm names, the dismissal rationale, the demographic profile of the principals. She had kept it because she had been dismissed in similar rooms and had learned that memory alone was not enough. You needed the record. The record was the evidence. She had not shared it with anyone. She had been waiting, without admitting it to herself, for a moment when sharing it would accomplish something other than ending her own position in the room. Watching Calhoun interrupt Denise Okafor 4 minutes into a 15-minute presentation, she decided the moment had arrived. The two women sat in the hotel lobby that evening, Vivian's laptop open between them. 17 vendors dismissed by Calhoun without full review. 11 of them were firms owned by women or people of color. The pattern was not subtle. It was not a matter of interpretation. It was a column of numbers that told the same story 17 times. Denise read it without speaking, carefully, completely, without allowing the weight of it to move her before she had finished understanding it. When she was done, she closed the laptop gently and said 5 words. "Who else has seen this?" "No one," Vivian said. "Until now." Denise nodded once. She removed a plain card from her portfolio, a name and a number, and set it on the table between them. "Call this person tomorrow morning," she said. "Tell them I sent you." The name on the card was an attorney in Columbus who specialized in procurement discrimination cases and had won 3 of them in federal court. Denise had retained her 2 years earlier, not because she had expected to need her, but because her father had taught her that preparation was not pessimism. It was respect for the work you had done. It was not anger that drove what happened next. It was not revenge. It was the record, laid on the table, and a woman who had kept it, and another woman who knew exactly what to do with it. The filing landed on the desk of the Ohio Civil Rights Commission on a Wednesday morning in April of 2007. It was 43 pages long. It contained Vivian Torres's 4 years of documentation, Meridian's full performance record, the names and contact information of 11 dismissed vendor principals, and a legal brief prepared by an attorney named Sandra Whitfield, who had won 3 federal procurement discrimination cases and who did not file unless she intended to finish. Denise Okafor had not called a press conference. She had gone home to Columbus, given Sandra Whitfield everything she needed, and gone back to work. That was the entirety of her retaliation. 43 pages, delivered quietly, by a woman who had been prepared for exactly this moment without knowing it. The Ohio Civil Rights Commission assigned the case to an investigator named Paul Reyes, a former procurement auditor who had spent 12 years reviewing exactly this kind of institutional pattern. He contacted all 11 dismissed vendors. 9 responded. 7 agreed to provide statements. The pattern Vivian Torres had documented across 4 years was confirmed, independently, 7 times over. Reyes completed his preliminary report in 6 weeks. It left no room for interpretation. The consortium's board convened an emergency session in June. They had retained outside counsel the moment the filing became public. which it did, because Sandra Whitfield had timed the public records request with the precision of someone who understood that sunlight was the most effective disinfectant. The board reviewed Reyes's preliminary findings, reviewed their own vendor selection records for the previous 4 years, and then reviewed the legal exposure those records represented. Richard Calhoun resigned his position as managing director of Calhoun Industrial Partners on a Thursday afternoon. The resignation letter cited a desire to spend more time with his family. No one who read it believed that because the timing was not ambiguous, and the filing was a matter of public record, and the 43 pages had been thorough. The consortium issued a formal public statement acknowledging systemic failures in its vendor selection process and announcing a new independent review protocol for all future procurement decisions. It was called the Equitable Review Standard, and it required that every vendor receive a complete documented evaluation before any dismissal, with written rationale reviewed by a party independent of the selection panel. It was not a monument. It was a process. But a process, enforced, outlasts a monument every time. Vivian Torres was not fired. She had made peace with that possibility before she opened her laptop in the hotel lobby. What happened, instead, was that 3 consortium board members, reviewing what she had documented and the risk she had taken to document it, voted in the fall of 2007 to appoint her to the board's newly formed Vendor Equity Committee. She served as its chair for 6 years. She did not consider it a reward. She considered it work that needed doing. Denise Okafor was awarded contracts by 2 of the consortium's member companies in the summer of 2007, not as a consolation, but as a consequence of the review process that had required those companies to actually read her performance data and reference letters, which they had not done before because Calhoun had not asked them to. The numbers justified the contracts. Meridian Logistics Group's revenue grew 30% in the following fiscal year. She did not celebrate publicly. She called her father. Gerald Okafor was 71 years old by then, retired, living in the same house on the east side. He answered on the second ring the way he always did. She told him everything: the filing, the investigation, the resignation, the contracts. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The work was the noise." She could hear him smiling. She did not need to see it. She drove to Columbus that weekend and sat with him on the back porch, and they drank coffee in the late afternoon light. And he told her about a boy named Marcus DeWitt, who had sat at that same kitchen table 20 years before with a composition notebook and a question about officer candidates, and how he had watched that boy become something the world had not expected because the world had not been paying attention. "That's what happens," Gerald said, "when you let the work go where the noise can't." Denise had heard the story before. She listened to it again. Now, here's what I want you to hold on to, because this is not a story about 2 exceptional people. It is a story about what happens in ordinary rooms every day, in every city, in every industry, where someone with a title and a theory decides in 30 seconds what another person is worth. Richard Calhoun did not think of himself as a man who discriminated. He thought of himself as a man with experience, with pattern recognition, with a reliable instinct for quality. He had never examined those patterns. He had never been asked to. The room had always deferred to him, and deference is a powerful anesthetic. It numbs the part of a person that might otherwise ask whether they are actually right. Dale Pruitt had felt the same thing, sitting behind his desk in 1987 with a plaque on the wall and his theory about potential. He had not thought of himself as a man who was closing doors. He had thought of himself as a man who knew what he was looking at. They were both wrong in the same way, not with malice, but with certainty. And certainty, unexamined, is its own kind of cruelty. The people on the other side of that certainty: Marcus DeWitt walking 3 miles home in November cold, Denise Okafor finishing a presentation that no one on the panel had intended to hear. They did not have the luxury of being wrong with confidence. They had to be right, carefully and completely, and they had to be right in a way that left a record, because they had learned from their elders and from the rooms that had already dismissed them that memory alone was not enough. You needed the work. You needed the notebook. You needed the documentation. You needed the kind of preparation that looks like patience from the outside and feels from the inside like the only form of power available to you. Raymond DeWitt said not to argue with the lid. Build until you outgrow it. Gerald Okafor said to let the work be the noise. 2 men, 2 porches, 2 cups of coffee, the same instruction given in different words to 2 children who were paying attention. The question is not whether you have been in a room like the one in Cincinnati, or the one in East Columbus, or the one in every city where someone decided what you were worth before they knew who you were. The question is what you did with it, what you wrote in the notebook, what you kept building in the silence where no one was watching, because the rooms do not always correct themselves, but sometimes, when the work is thorough enough and the record is kept carefully enough, and there is one person in the back of the room who has been waiting for the right moment to stop being silent. Sometimes the room has to reckon with what it refused to see. Not with anger, not with revenge, with the long, patient, irrefutable weight of what was built anyway. If someone has ever dismissed you before they knew what you were carrying, drop a comment and tell me what you built in the silence. I want to hear it. And if this story found you at the right moment, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that the work is never wasted, even when no one is watching yet. Every week on this channel, we find the people the world overlooked and tell their stories the way they deserve to be told. If that matters to you, subscribe and stay with us. The photograph in the Columbus Library does not need a caption. Neither does the back porch on Maplewood Avenue, where the chair is still there, and the light still falls the same way in the late afternoon, and somewhere in the house a lamp is on.